Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan Sommer in Tel Aviv. My guest on the podcast today is Elizabeth Tsurkov. Until she was kidnapped in March 2023 and held captive for 2.5 years, Elizabeth Tsurkov was only a familiar name to those of us who closely follow the Middle East and the opinion and commentary that swirls around it. Elizabeth was born in Russia, moved to Israel as a child, and as a young adult, she was active in Palestinian human rights work, became fluent in Arabic, and deeply interested in developments in the Arab world beyond the Palestinian question. Her interests led her to activism, journalism, and professionally as an academic, pursuing a PhD at Princeton University with a focus on sectarianism in Syria and Iraq. She was also a prominent and forceful presence on social media, getting involved in conversations and discussions about the region, Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. While researching her doctorate in Baghdad, she was kidnapped by the group Kataib Hezbollah in March 2023 and was released in September of 2025, 2.5 years later. Since her release, Elizabeth has given media interviews focused on the story of her kidnapping and captivity, which included deep suffering and truly horrific forms of torture, including sexual assault, particularly during the early months of the 903 days of her captivity. This will not be one of those interviews. Recovering in Tel Aviv from the physical toll that her captivity took on her, particularly injuries in her back, Elizabeth is intent on returning to the career that was disrupted 2.5 years ago, studying, following, analyzing, and advocating for populations in the region and the countries she cares about. I sat down with her in Israel, her base, as she works on her physical recovery and professional comeback. Elizabeth is writing articles, restarting her academic research, and has also returned to social media, where, despite her ordeal, she is not holding back on her opinions. Her advocacy for human rights and freedom, it seems, have been sharpened, not dulled by her ordeal. Our conversation is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Elizabeth Tsurkov, thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Elizabeth, we're going to talk about all of the countries in the region where your professional expertise lies, but I want to start closer to home. Many people who have gone through what you have might be keeping a low profile, avoiding controversy, but you're right out there on X, on what used to be Twitter, posting about Palestinian human rights, condemning Israeli behavior in the West Bank and Gaza when you see it deserves condemnation. You made some headlines recently when a very prominent television pundit, Amit Segel, who was triggered by your comments on the killing of 2 boys by the IDF forces in Gaza, he said you were, quote, an obsessive person who hates their country. And that's far from the worst thing that's been said by some people on the Israeli right, and some of whom said that they had advocated for your release and now they regret it. Are you really ready to be back in this fray after everything you've been through?
Well, I'm very sorry for people that they regret fighting for my release. I will just go get kidnapped again so that they don't feel this remorse. You know, for 903 days, I was deprived of my ability to speak up. And this is something that has always been important to me. I'm a very political person, interested in politics since I was a young girl. So it is important for me to speak up. The episode with Segel was definitely quite unpleasant. He's very influential. And because of what he wrote, he also called me scum and that I'm obsessive against the state of Israel. I received really thousands of very, very hostile messages. And this is something that preceded him as well. I definitely received a new wave of hateful messages, but even before that, since coming out, and when people realize that my views have not substantially changed, I still see Arabs as human beings, which is an unpopular opinion, it seems, in Israel since October 7th. I started receiving really very, very hateful messages. And the disturbing thing is that I'm not particularly unique. The media atmosphere in Israel since October 7th has become very, very polarized and very aggressive and extreme. So even hostages and hostage families have been attacked by right-wing media, usually not Channel 12, the way that happened with me, which is really kind of a mainstream outlet. But hostages, for example, who didn't thank the prime minister for their release were also attacked. Families that were outspoken about the need to bring their loved ones home to end the war in Gaza also received vitriol. And I think that this reflects a trend in Israel, particularly after October 7th, of really kind of the circle of people towards whom one feels compassion shrinking very significantly from, let's say, all Israelis and also maybe Palestinians, particularly children, women, people who really kind of seem unrelated to kind of any militant activity. That has now been reduced to really Israelis only. But even within Israel, increasingly kind of you feel compassion just in the case of the right in particular, just toward people who share your own views. And therefore, families who've gone through the worst thing that could happen to a family, a kidnapping of a loved one, are also demonized severely. And in my case, of course, it is something that I did not expect the extent and the ferociousness of the vitriol that I faced, but it is something that is, because of my political views, it's something that is not particularly surprising. And this vitriol has been quite uncomfortable. But, I tell myself, and I genuinely feel it, that I've gone through things that are way, way worse. I've gone through really months of really quite severe torture and abuse, that this is really nothing. And therefore, their efforts to kind of silence me or expect me to, disappear into the night and stay silent, that expectation is deeply unfounded.
Some people came out of captivity. I'm referring obviously to the Israeli hostages held by Hamas with very different impressions that it seemed to really change them. Alon Ohel, the most recently released hostage who has spoken out, who really does not seem like he held any kind of right-wing views, was interviewed on television, and they referred to innocent civilians in Gaza, and he said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. So it sounds like you have come out of captivity, of your experience, without that kind of change in your basic views when it comes to human rights, when it comes to freedom, when it comes to the various fights for self-determination in the Middle East. Do you feel like, politically or fundamentally, when you look at these countries that you know so well, you feel the same as you did before you were taken hostage?
Yes, largely I feel the same. I also, of course, understand people who have gone through such experiences who then collectively blame an entire population for really something absolutely horrific that they went through. For example, I met with survivors of the Yazidi genocide I met in Iraq, and they spoke about Muslims. As a group, there are billions of Muslims around the world, and they spoke about them, as if they're a single group. And I don't blame them, and I don't blame Alon, and I don't blame anyone else who speaks this way. This is completely understandable. It's also a very natural response to trauma. But I simply don't see things this way. I think October 7th has changed my views to some extent. The brutality of the attack itself, the use of sexual violence, which is not permissible in Islam. It is something that is strictly prohibited.
In captivity, you were taken in March 2023. You had enough awareness of what was going on in the world to understand what had happened to Israel on October 7th?
So I was given a TV in the second prison, the prison where I wasn't tortured, at the very end of 23. And then I was able to start piecing things together, but I was exposed overwhelmingly to Arab language media, including media that is critical of Hamas, like Saudi and Emirati media. But it is critical of Hamas not because of the horrible abuses of October 7th, but because of their disregard for the lives of Palestinians. Basically, Palestinians, after several months of slaughter, they overwhelmingly in Gaza, the desire was for the war to end at whatever cost. And the survival of Hamas as an armed organization is not something that is of concern to the overwhelming majority of Gazans. They just want to live, they just want to eat. And Hamas leadership ignored those calls. So the criticism was about this disregard for Palestinian lives. So many of the details about October 7th, I learned them gradually. For example, I learned about the Bibas family only in June 24. Arabic media simply does not cover them. Of course, Al Jazeera and channels that are financed by Qatar are straight up, propaganda channels for Hamas. They completely ignore the atrocities that occurred on October 7th, and they consistently refer to hostages as asra, as prisoners, kind of legitimizing the kidnapping and mentioning all men as soldiers, male hostages, even though a very tiny share of those kidnapped were soldiers. And even after I came out, I started reading more things that were really very rarely covered. For example, the issue of sexual assault. This is something that I knew about from a little bit of Israeli media that was available to me. But the extent of it, I only learned when I had access to the internet and read the New York Times report about it.
And the change in Israeli society that has happened since October 7th and the experience of the last 2 years, you must have only really understood the impact once you got here.
Yeah, and this is something that I'm still learning. And people really have changed in very fundamental ways. Death is much more present in their lives. They're thinking more about the possibility of being killed. For example, people are joking amongst each other. In Israel, if you walk around in the streets, you see stickers everywhere for the fallen on October 7th and soldiers later on. Several people in my surrounding have joked about what will I want written on the sticker when I'm killed. There are many more people carrying guns, people signing up for, Krav Maga lessons to be able to protect themselves. So there's really is a great sense of insecurity. And of course, people I once knew who were compassionate towards Palestinians, at least, Palestinians who are clearly not involved in any way in militant activity, for example, children. This is something that has changed. People are no longer compassionate. There is this tendency to castigate an entire group for the action of the militants who broke through and slaughtered, kidnapped on October 7th.
What do you think it is about you that makes you not susceptible to this kind of switch after you've been through the worst of the worst?
Generally, as someone who has studied the Middle East and was kidnapped while conducting research, my situation is quite different from individuals who were partying or were sleeping in their beds in southern Israel. They don't have the background and the knowledge of the region and its complexities to a large extent.
Because you were an academic or because you were taking a calculated risk, do you think?
Because I simply, I can read Arabic, I speak Arabic, I'm able to speak to Gazans, I'm able to follow the voices that come out of Gaza from various sources of information.
And you were able to speak to your captors in Iraq.
Yes, and of course, that as well. I think that in general, I tend to see reality as quite complex. And the horrible experience that I went through, even in captivity, there was variance in the way I was treated. For example, between the first facility and the second facility, there were people in captivity from the kidnappers, from Qatar Hezbollah, who were compassionate towards me. And therefore, I don't have this tendency to paint people with one brush. So in Iraq, I was kidnapped by a Shia militia, but I also spent many months conducting interviews among Shia Iraqis who are members of a Sadrist current. They're not the people who are in any way related to my kidnapping, and spending time with them and interacting with them and staying in their homes. So most of the people who've been kidnapped into Gaza, or Israelis in general, have never interacted with Gazans, don't see the complexities. And there, of course, there is the level of atrocities that Israelis witnessed on October 7th is something that this is what political violence does. This is its purpose. By people who use political violence, this is their purpose, to drive people apart, to create hatred, to prevent any kind of peaceful solutions from taking place. And it was very successful in the case of the 7th of October massacres. And this is something that, for example, was used quite explicitly by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Its former leader, Zarqawi, purposefully instigated a civil war, basically by targeting Shia shrines, to get Sunnis and Shias divided and to get Sunnis to rally around the flag of Al-Qaeda as the protectors of the sect. So this is what political violence does. And we see the results in Israeli public opinion, Palestinian public opinion, just immense hatred and distrust. And this is something that I'm afraid we will have to live with the repercussions of this for many, many decades to come.
Iraq just went through elections. You, given your exposure now to the wide spectrum of Iraq, when you were there as, I guess, a relatively privileged graduate student researcher, and from the very different perspective of a hostage being held by a militia, and with your, academic and professional expertise, can you give us your read on the results of these recent elections, how it's affecting the balance of power of these pro-Iranian Shiite parties and militias inside the government and their conflict with the prime minister, who I understand is trying to limit their power? Is it simplistic to say it's a mini proxy war inside Iraq of the U.S. Western versus Iran conflict?
No, there's definitely a conflict that is happening in Iraq between kind of pro-American and pro-Iranian camp. The results of the elections are extremely favorable to the pro-Iranian camp. It now completely dominates the parliament. And it is likely that the next prime minister will be someone who is basically under the thumb of these parties. And this is why these parties and these militias spent billions of dollars, trillions of Iraqi dinars, by votes, to coerce votes from their own members and from their relatives, and spent a lot of time electioneering, like doing campaigns, holding rallies, etc. Because the parliament in Iraq is not really a decision-making body, but the size of your bloc affects your ability to influence the identity of the prime minister, and also in the direction of the country in terms of pro or anti-Iran. And also it is something that determines how much of the cake, which is the state budget in Iraq, you're going to get, how many projects you're going to get, basically the ability to siphon off from the public coffers. And these militias have spent, under Soudani, under the current prime minister, he really gave them a free hand to pillage. So they've amassed really billions upon billions of dollars. And they spent some of those to buy votes. And I think what's interesting about the election results is that the official turnout rate that Iraq releases, that the Electoral Commission releases, is merely among the people who registered to vote. And as a result, it is inflated because basically about a third of Iraqis didn't bother to register to vote. So the actual turnout rate in the last elections is 37.5%, which means that a majority of Iraqis are despondent about the ability to bring about any change to the political system. And this is kind of the most important result. And this is despite the fact that you could sell your vote for about $200 in certain districts that were more competitive, sometimes even more, sometimes less. And people wouldn't sell, wouldn't bother, and just stayed at home. So this is, I think, a testament to really kind of the bankruptcy of the system and the lack of hope that Iraqis feel about the ability to change anything in the country.
I mean, I confess, like many Americans and people around the world, since the defeat of ISIS, we kind of tuned out to what was going on in Iraq. We're supposedly at the very end of the phased U.S. withdrawal from the country. And I suppose Iran is kind of stepping into that vacuum. And that's why these militias are, strengthening, gathering strength politically and on the ground. I mean, Is Iraq a functioning state? Can it be with these militias wielding power? I'm kind of reminded of the Hezbollah state within a state in Lebanon. Is that basically what's shaping up in Iraq as well?
Iraq is definitely not a functioning state. It is quite a quintessential kind of failed oil state, where basically because there's all this money to be extracted from state coffers, different actors leech on the state and basically suck up resources that don't reach the population. So if you walk around the streets of cities in Iraq, as I've done, you see really areas that look like they've gone through war, but they never did. There's very, very poor infrastructure. There's a lot of corruption. So you have projects starting up in different areas, and like they dig up a street, for example, and then the money runs out and it just stays this way. There's garbage really covering much of the great areas in streets and outskirts of cities. There's, of course, no clean water, and electricity is cut off most of the time. And this is despite the fact that Iraq has immense oil reserves and gas. So Iraq is really kind of a tragic case of a very, very poorly managed country. The blame for this is on the entire political system, not just the militias. The entire political system is made up of parties that are basically made up of thieves. They're all just stealing from state coffers and then distribute some of those stolen riches on election day to buy votes. The public sector is horribly inflated in Iraq because basically people are given jobs in exchange for their loyalty, in exchange for their vote and the vote of their family members. So, for example, Soudani, during his last term of 3 years, hired about 1 million people into the public sector. In fact, there was a need to cut millions of people from the payroll. They're sitting inside offices and doing nothing. Like, I have friends who are state employees. They come in, they nap in their office, they drink tea, they smoke, they chat with the guys, and then they go home at 2 p.m. And of course, there are also many people who are just ghost employees. They don't even show up. They don't even bother sitting around napping in their chair, So all parties are responsible for this. But the militias are particularly to blame because they also operate as armed groups outside of the actual control of the state. Even though the militias were officially subsumed under the prime minister's office, in reality, he does not control them. And my kidnapping is proof of that. He wanted to get me out, and he couldn't because he has no control over these militias, the prime minister. So these militias, on top of the fact that they're stealing from state coffer, they're also extorting from the population. So if you're, for example, a successful business person, they will come to you and ask for a cut. If you refuse, they can kidnap you and extract the money from you. This has happened, They can kill you. They can set on fire your, let's say, mall if you started it without their approval. So as a result, they've infiltrated kind of all the private sector. In 2019, when millions of Iraqis came to the streets demanding the fall of this corrupt system, they were the ones who were leading the charge in repressing these protests and slaughtering. They slaughtered about 800 protesters, activists, kidnapped some of them. So they are the ones who are helping keep this deeply unpopular system in power.
Do you see any hope for changing it? And I'm also wondering if you got any new insights, during your period of captivity, getting into the minds of these people. Again, I'm referring to the Israeli hostages in Gaza, that they feel like they had great insights into how Hamas thinks, and they weren't academic, researchers, and they weren't fluent in Arabic. Do you feel like you got really, good insights into why these militias grab the people, how they keep them in power? And do you see any way out of it? Do you see any vision for Iraq going forward? Or do you see, just continued chaos and conflict, and I guess eventually if weakness being pulled more into the orbit of Iran?
With regards to whether I feel hopeful, I think things seem very bleak right now. But at the same time, Iraqis won't change. It's not that they're happy with the current system. And the way the system is run, it is utterly unsustainable. So these hirings, for example, that occurred over the past 3 years, drained the state coffers to an extent that they struggled to pay salaries. They started taking money from pension funds and things of this nature to finance salaries, basically. So this is not something that can continue forever. Now, it could be that things will change for the worse, but I certainly hope that they will somehow change for the better. But right now, there is no clear path for reform and change, because the current system is really not reformable, in my view. And in the view of most Iraqis, because most of them didn't vote. Like, if they felt that it was possible to change the system from then, they would have gone and voted. With regards to insight into the militias, so I never studied the militias before. I very purposefully avoided any contact with them, knowing that this is risky. So I just focused on the Sadr's current and on civilians within that current, which is the largest political current in Iraq. It has about 1 million members. And on top of it, it is likely the largest political movement in the entire Middle East, because after the Muslim Brotherhood was crushed in Egypt in 2013, it has the most members, basically. And it is led by Muqtada Sadr, who was previously the commander of Jaysh al-Mahdi, which fought the American occupying forces in Iraq. And now it is really not engaged in militancy. So my focus was on civilian supporters of this current. So I stayed away from the militias. And I definitely gained a great deal of understanding of who they are. For sure, there are people inside these militias who are just like psychopaths, including the people who tortured me. Deeply evil individuals who enjoy hurting and humiliating other human beings. But at the same time, it seems to me that the overwhelming majority, and this is what also my Iraqi friends and interlocutors tell me, since I've come out and spoken to them about my experience, that the overwhelming majority of the people who are in the ranks of these militias, they've joined for salary. And therefore, they know that they need to adopt the rhetoric of, yes, we want martyrdom, and yes, Palestine is important for us, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, etc. But in reality, they're not at all, like, if you cut their salaries, they will go home. They will find another job. They're not, some of them will turn into criminal gangs using the weapons that they have to extort people, but many others will just go home and work some other job. And I think that this is something that is important to keep in mind. And this is definitely something that I'm planning on writing about at greater length, about the insights that I've gained through this really kind of horrible experience. But I did spend, 2.5 years with these people.
A form of research.
Yes, exactly. Very immersive.
Yeah. I understand a lot of your actual research you had to leave behind, right? You didn't get to bring it.
No, so thankfully, all the oral histories that I've collected, I've backed them up in the cloud, thank God. And I was able to recreate the bibliography. And so I'm already working on my PhD again, meeting my committee soon again. And while in captivity, during the first month of captivity, when I wasn't tortured yet, I was starved, but I wasn't beaten. Basically, I had a lot of time on my hand and nothing to do. And I thought a lot about my PhD and really kind of developed the outline for the dissertation. And I kept writing it on pieces of cardboard, and they would confiscate the pieces of cardboard and I would write it again. So I basically memorized it. And even though in captivity, in the second prison, they gave me notebooks, and I kept a notebook with research ideas, that notebook was left behind, very, very tragically. That was the main thing that was on my mind on the day of my release. What about my notebook? But because I kept writing it again and again on these pieces of cardboard that they confiscated, I was able to recreate it. So I'm back on track on working on my PhD.
Speaking of your research and your work and your writing, you've been deeply invested in the history and fate of Syria for many years. We're moving now from Iraq to Syria as a scholar and as a journalist and as an activist. And you recently published an article for the New Lines Institute where you're a fellow. And you said, quote, "The Syrian regime collapsed on day 628 of the 903 days I spent in captivity. From my cell on a militia base in Iraq, I watched the news coverage for hours and wept with joy." Can you tell us why you were so joyful?
I know thousands of victims of this regime. People who were killed by this regime, and people who were incarcerated by it, and people who were displaced from their homes because of it, who lost everything dear to them. And I heard from Syrian friends and contacts, and also through reading literature, what it was like to live under this dictatorship. People would be afraid to speak about politics even inside their home. There was this constant fear. It was a real totalitarian regime in the sense that every sphere was occupied by the regime. It was in your bedroom, wives or husbands would occasionally report on their spouse if they said something wrong or, disloyal that in the way that they perceived it. So there was this, people lived in a constant state of fear. And I was in touch with people across areas of Syria during the civil war, people in rebel-held areas and Kurdish-held areas and also regime-held areas. And people there just lived in constant fear. There was, I have a friend, he's Alawi, from the area of Qardah, which is the hometown of the Assad family. And he opposes the regime, and so does his mother. But his father was always just afraid of saying anything. And he has a sister, and the sister once said in front of the father, I really like the regime, meaning like the routine of my life. I don't like things to change, And he was startled by the word regime, nizam, because it is a word that was refused by the Assad regime because it indicates something authoritarian, totalitarian. It would constantly speak about a government, the Syrian government, even though the Syrian government is completely powerless. So even the word regime, spoken in the context of something about the regime of life, like a life routine, was something that was terrifying for him to hear. So just imagine the state of terror that people lived under. The city of Hama, for example, in 1982, about 40,000 people were slaughtered there in a huge massacre by the Hafiz al-Assad regime. And buried. And people were not able to speak about it. They were not able to mourn their dead because there was this constant fear that someone will say something. So I knew what it meant for Syrians. And on that day also, and the days prior, the 11 days during which the opposition advanced on Damascus, there were multiple prisons that were busted open. And these skeletons are coming out walking, of prisoners who have suffered immensely. So it was just deeply emotional moment for Syrians, but also for me.
As a scholar, would you have predicted that it would be Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, that would be the group to be the one to overthrow Assad, and that it would successfully manage to hold the country together and rule for a year? And, from what you've seen so far, how would you assess the first year of the Syrian government led by President al-Shara?
Overall, before my kidnapping, I started conducting research on kind of the breakup of the Syrian state. Basically, because of the financial crisis in Lebanon that also affected Syria, the government, the services, the civilian services were going completely broke. I interviewed teachers who don't show up to their work because the cost of going to work, just the transportation, is higher than the salaries that they receive. So there was deep dysfunction within the state. I interviewed soldiers, for example, in the Syrian army who were constantly being extorted by their officers to basically, they had to pay a bribe to go home. And they would go home on vacation, but not to actually rest. They would work a second job to basically survive, Soldiers would go hungry. So there was deep dysfunction within the state and even within the regime, at least the army. Of course, that doesn't mean that I, foresaw the fall of the regime. That is something that was significantly helped by the consequences of October 7th and the weakening of the Iranian axis and Lebanese Hezbollah, and also the Ukraine war and the Russian preoccupation there. But the Syrian army was incredibly weak. It hasn't won a single battle in Syria since February of 2012. That was the last time that it won a battle on its own. They basically ethnically cleansed the neighborhood of Bab Amr in Homs. Since then, they've either lost or they won owing to help by Lebanese Hezbollah, then by Iraqi Shia militias, including the one that kidnapped me, Qatar Hezbollah, and the Russians. So the army was very, very weak. And because the Iranian axis believes that the jihadists, Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and Daesh, ISIS, are basically created by the West and by the Israelis, they believed that the offensive that the rebels started a day after the war on Hezbollah ended, the Israeli war, they believed that this is just another chapter and that basically they're not facing the rebels, who number 30,000 people, fighters with mostly light weapons, they believed that they were facing Israel. And therefore they reacted this way and fled en masse towards Iraq, towards Damascus, and then flew off into Lebanon. So this was something that was quite helpful. With regards to my assessment, definitely the new authorities in Damascus have had immense success in really were not for their diplomatic skills and early on efforts to establish relations with Gulf countries, to diversify their foreign alliances, to go beyond kind of Turkey and Qatar. They wouldn't have gotten to where they have, where sanctions were removed in the States.
Because people saw such great potential in Syria, where the Iranian influence was gone and the Russians were basically gone. They said, let's push as hard as we can.
Domestically, the Syrian state is broke. They cannot even pay salaries. The Qataris are supporting Syria with paying state salaries, and therefore is limited in its ability to do much to improve the lives of Syrians. There are very concerning trends. I've studied Hayat Tahrir al-Sham for many years. I've interviewed members and commanders within this faction when they were still not the rulers of Damascus. And the group has changed significantly over time. It has really abandoned the principles, the guiding principles of jihadism and Salafism.
You don't believe they're terrorists wearing suits?
Terrorist is in general kind of a very political word. They have in years past killed civilians, kidnapped civilians in 2013, for example. But this is something that they have avoided in recent years, really entirely. They've not purposefully targeted civilians, with the exception of activists who oppose them. And this is my main concern, and the concern of many Syrians, is the authoritarian tendency. So it's not about jihadism or Salafism or whatever. It is about the fact that they are deeply authoritarian. So this affects power sharing on a national level. So we saw, for example, what happened in Sweden in July, when the Syrian authorities decided to solve a political dispute with Sweden, the Druze area, through sending in military force. And because the military force is very undisciplined and pumped up with sectarian animus, there were really horrible massacres that took place against Druze civilians. So this was a political dispute that should have been resolved through political negotiations. But because the Druze leadership was demanding political concessions and not just local security arrangements, this is something that was refused by Damascus. And we see this issue of power sharing also internally. So the hirings that are taking place now within the Syrian state, all the top positions go to HTS people. All decision-making is very tightly held by them. They have hired additional people from other forces, independent individuals, technocrats, but decision-making power really lies with people who are loyal. And unfortunately, at times, they're not people who are capable. So they prefer loyalty over skills. And as a result, you have people in very senior positions, deputy ministers, for example, who are incompetent. But it is because they're loyal to HTS.
But I guess in the wake of the extreme horrors of the Assad regime, all of this looks like, little middle of the road, quote unquote, normal authoritarianism doesn't look so bad.
It's even hard to compare between them because really the Assad dictatorship was one of the most brutal.
A year later, we're still learning of some of how bad the atrocities were.
Yes, and every couple of weeks there is a new mass grave that pops up. The horrors that Syrians have gone through are unimaginable, and this is why I understand the relief of the majority of Syrians inside the country and abroad, who are very, very happy about this change. Of course, the situation differs with minorities concerned for their safety. So previously, under the Assad regime, they were oppressed politically. They were afraid to speak inside their home, but they felt safe that if they follow certain rules, if they keep silent, if they obey, they will not be harmed. Whereas this is not the case now. People have been killed simply for being Alawi, simply for being Druze.
Do you have a take on the hard line that Israel is taking in terms of Syria? Very, very vigilant. Last week, 13 people were killed in a firefight when Israel tried to arrest 2 members of the Islamic group there. And Trump reacted very strongly to it. Trump seems like he has a little bit of a crush on al-Shara, that, he has great potential. He posted to social media, the American president, that it is very important that Israel maintain a strong and true dialogue with Syria, and nothing takes place that will interfere with Syria's evolution into a prosperous state. So this dynamic of Trump as the Syrian leader's champion, dreaming of a security pact, even joining the Abraham Accords, versus what Netanyahu sees and versus what the Israeli government is seeing. Are you with Trump or are you with Bibi?
I think the Israeli policy in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime has been driven to a large extent by the trauma of October 7th. So basically a fear of another Islamist regime on the borders with Israel. They may cross and start slaughtering, the residents of the Golan. And also by poor understanding of, as far as I saw from media reporting, Israeli intelligence really didn't keep track of HTS. They were far away in Idlib, not on the borders with Israel. They posed no threat to Israel from far away. They were not relevant. And therefore, the evolution of the group and the way that it governed Idlib, something that I wrote about, that other researchers of Syria have written about, really went under the radar for Israeli policymakers. And as a result, there is this perception that these are people who are just, pretending to have changed their attitudes. When in fact, they really have genuinely changed their attitude on issues that are of concern to Israel, which is, Salafism, jihadism. They have not changed their ways with regards to authoritarianism, which is of concern to Syrians. So I think that Trump's policy with regards to Syria is driven by the understanding that there is no better alternative to what is in charge now. The alternative is chaos, basically, and Iranian militias being able to smuggle weapons en masse again, as they used to do, to Lebanese Hezbollah through Syrian territory. And also, of course, by the influence of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, who lobbied for Shara and his new government. The decision to remove sanctions from Syria, I think, is an excellent decision. Those sanctions were put on the Assad regime, not on HTS and not on the Syrian population. The Assad regime is gone. I do think that Western policy needs to be very careful not to create the impression in Damascus that anything that they do, that they can go in, carry out 2 large-scale massacres in the span of 1 year, and everything will be forgiven and it's water under the bridge. The lives of Syrians of all sects matter. And also this very authoritarian tendency. This is not something that has received any pushback as far as I can tell.
Elizabeth, we've gone around the region. We've covered Iraq. We've gone into Syria. We didn't really get into Lebanon. That's a whole other podcast. But back to our backyard for a moment. As we record, Trump is pushing to move forward the second stage of his plan to create some kind of governance in Gaza that will theoretically replace Hamas. As a scholar of the dynamics of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, sectarianism, when you look at the Trump plan for Gaza and in general overall attempts to create a Palestinian entity, does it seem possible to you that with these countries with so much more size, wealth, influence, potential, they're struggling to achieve any kind of stability? Is it possible in this devastated, decimated place that we call Gaza? What's your take on that situation?
Of course, Trump kind of really forcing the end to the war is an absolutely, blessed decision. And the day the hostages returned to Israel, the 20 living hostages, I think it's probably the best day in Israeli history. It was just, I saw so many people literally crying on the street of joy. And so was I, It was just absolutely a fantastic day.
And this was so shortly after your own release.
It was absolutely fantastic because I knew what it meant for their families, for the hostages. It was just really a very, very emotional, exhilarating day. And of course, for Gazans, they live an absolutely horrible reality. Most of the infrastructure has been destroyed, their homes, etc. But at least they're not getting killed with such a high tempo as they used to before the ceasefire went into effect. I am conscious of the fact that, of course, hundreds have been killed since, but it is not at the same scale. And also, the severe restrictions on entry of food and goods were lifted. So this is something also that matters greatly to Gazans. The plan that was first articulated, right as the ceasefire went into effect, is very vague. And it is not clear how we can continue from this point on. Hamas refuses to disarm, even though its arms are useless. And this is something that Palestinians inside Gaza have spoken up against again and again during the war, because they felt that they were dying for nothing. For Israelis, this is a very long and bloody war, and many soldiers were killed. But for Palestinians, it was an absolute catastrophe in the sense that this is just completely pointless. That the way Hamas presented itself as this kind of effective resistance, and the way that Al Jazeera and other channels presented it, is completely misses reality, which is a kind of a very one-sided war in which, they're getting killed in large numbers daily, and Israel is barely affected in any kind of way. So Hamas is insisting on keeping these useless weapons that have only brought destruction upon Palestinians and, of course, Israel. And international donors and countries that are interested in participating in, rebuilding Gaza are saying, we are not going to send in forces as long as Hamas keeps its arms. Like, we will not go start firefights with Hamas militants. So things appear to be stuck at the moment. There were recent reporting that, Trump is pushing for things to progress, before the end of the year, and some kind of handing over responsibilities to some kind of a new authority that will be in place.
I mean, it seems like deja vu all over again. We're going to have an attempted overall, government run the way that governments are supposed to, but it doesn't seem like these militias and these factions are ever really going to be, neutralized.
Yeah, and the Israeli model of, supporting these militias inside Gaza as an alternative to Hamas's rule, this is definitely not something that seems to be working at all. I mean, first of all, these militias are made up of criminals to a large extent. They're also people who, even if they did not have a criminal background during the war, they engage in wide-scale looting of aid that goes into Gaza. And therefore, they're widely hated by Gazans, who also don't like Hamas, but these people are not seen as a credible alternative. And a possible credible alternative, to some extent, is the Palestinian Authority, and Israel is refusing to allow it back into governing Gaza. So there are huge challenges ahead. I genuinely don't see how we progress from here. And we're really in a situation, we are now months into the ceasefire. And essentially, the lives of Palestinians have improved because the violence is not as extensive and as deadly as before, but they're still living intense. They're living in really, really terrible conditions. It is now winter. It's constantly being flooded. And for any reconstruction to happen, there's a need for some kind of resolution, for something to give. And I don't see how this can happen. I really, really hope that I'm wrong and that some progress can be made. But right now, it seems quite bleak.
You credited, as most people do, President Trump for the ceasefire and for the release of the Israeli hostages. Essentially, he's also responsible pretty much for your release as well. I'm constantly drawn back to this in the podcast, the irony of how, most lovers of freedom, opponents of authoritarianism, who view Donald Trump in these kinds of terms and what he's doing to the United States and the rule of law and democracy in such negative terms. And yet, this is one of the very few parts of the world where, you do give him credit, right, for your release and for persistence. Is that, interesting, given the progressive circles you move in, the gratitude you feel for this president?
No, absolutely. Trump is the reason I'm free. This is not an interpretation. This is a fact. I know exactly how I came to be released. It was because of threats that were made on behalf of President Trump that were conveyed by the special envoy to Iraq, the American special envoy, Mark Savaya. He conveyed those threats from Trump to the Iraqi prime minister. The Iraqi prime minister conveyed these threats to Kataib Hezbollah. with a deadline of 1 week, and I was released within 1 week. So there's no doubt about what happened here. Adam Bowler, also the envoy for hostage affairs, also came into Baghdad repeatedly to press for my case, and also made very credible and strong threats to the militia. What will happen to you if you don't release her? Basically, the last threat that was issued by Mark was, if you don't release her within a week, we will kill the leadership of Kataib Hezbollah, and they simply let me go because they want to remain alive. They've stolen billions of dollars from the coffers of the Iraqi state, and they want to enjoy those funds in this life, not in the afterlife. So they chose to release me without anything given in return. The Trump's policy towards Syria is also something that any person who supports human rights should be applauding. The sanctions were harming the ability of Syria to recover, the ability of Syrians who are currently not eating enough in large numbers. Over 90% of them live in poverty. And poverty in Syria really means not being able to afford to even feed yourself. So that policy is excellent. And of course, Gaza, the war started under the Biden administration. He didn't use leverage that the US has to end this war. And then Trump did. So I think we need to judge the policies based on the results that they achieve. And the results, in my case, in the case of Syria, in the case of Gaza, the results are very beneficial to human life.
Elizabeth, let's wrap up back to you and your life and your future. Your self-description on X reads, in addition to passionate about human rights, freedom appreciator. And you have an Arabic tattoo with the word freedom shaped like the map of Syria with the colors of Syria, which I understood got you into some trouble with your captors in Iraq. They weren't a fan of your tattoo. I suppose that today you must appreciate freedom in a very different way before you got the tattoo. It's ironic that you got it before your captivity. So my final question is, what do you plan to do now with your freedom? You must have had plenty of time while you were there to dream, to plan, to think of what you wanted to do short term and long term. Has what you've been through made you crave the ivory tower as a scholar of what's going on in the Middle East? Although you never really were in the ivory tower. You like to do a lot of on-the-ground research, which, was the risk that you took and unfortunately led to what happened. How involved do you want to feel in shaping this region that you care about so much? Basically, what are your plans?
I intend to definitely finish my PhD at Princeton. I've already restarted work on the PhD. And I also want to share the insights that I've gained from this experience about the militias in Iraq and other insights in general about, the types of people who are capable of torturing others. And these are articles that I'm hoping to publish in the coming months. The region and its people matter a great deal to me. The Middle East is the least democratic region in the world. And this has grave implications for the lives of people in this region. Since coming out, I mentioned early on that I face a great deal of vitriol from Israelis, but I also received really thousands of very, very supportive messages from both Iraqis and Syrians, and many Iraqis who are saying, please speak up, we cannot. And it's not that they're cowards and unbrave, not at all. They're just in Iraq or they're Iraqi and they have relatives in Iraq, and therefore they will be punished severely, or their families, will be killed if they speak up. And people who have done so have been assassinated. For example, the scholar Hisham al-Hashimi, who has spoken up against the militias and was assassinated. So there are thousands of people in Iraq who have gone through an experience similar to mine and have actually suffered greater abuse than I did, because I was subjected to torture, but the torture was never severe to the point where they may kill me, because they kidnapped me for a ransom, and consistently until very, very late, their demand was a ransom in exchange for my release. So they didn't want to destroy the product, that they're selling. Whereas in the case of Iraqis, they have killed thousands of them under torture or have executed them. And they're still missing till this day. So it is something that I feel a great obligation toward the people of Iraq, toward other victims of these militias, to speak up about what is happening in Iraq. But I'm definitely going to continue to remain engaged now that, I'm free and I have the ability to do what I love doing, which is researching and reading and writing and speaking to people, as opposed to being in solitary confinement for 903 days and just reading like Shia religious books and watching TV. So now I can do things that are much more significant and more interesting for me.
Well, I wish you good luck. I'm sure everyone listening wishes you good luck and enjoying your freedom. And I'm very grateful that you've used some of that freedom to agree to come on the podcast and talk and have us listen into what you've learned and what you have to say. Really, good luck.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Elizabeth Tsurkov, and to producer Eli Shimoni and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to this podcast and make sure that you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan Sommer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.